Joining me is Dr. Trevor Hancock, professor at the University of Victoria and a prolific and pioneering scholar in the social and especially ecological determinants of health. Thank you so much for joining me, Trevor.
You're very welcome.
Maybe we can start by defining our terms. In a lot of your work, you've discussed the geological term of the Anthropocene and what that means just in terms of the fact that they're using it for our health.
The Anthropocene is a relatively new idea that emerged only about 15 years ago. A couple of the world's leading earth scientists. And what they observe as earth scientists is that humanity has become a force of nature, that we are having impacts on the planet that are equal to, or in some cases greater than, natural forces. And so they suggested that we are moving into a new geologic epoch. So right now we're in an epoch called the Holocene. It's lasted about 11,000 years. It's a period of it's called a warm interglacial period, and it's the period during which agriculture has emerged and civilizations have emerged. But they think that that is coming to an end, and that millions of years into the future, you'll be able to point to a point in the geologic record and say that's where the Anthropocene began. That's where human impact on the planet became so large that it shows up in the geologic record.
And should that be something that intrinsically frightens people, or is that a natural progression of events?
Well, I'm not sure I'd say frightened. I think it should be a matter of concern, because the sort of changes we are creating to the Earth's natural systems are taking us beyond the boundaries of what some scientists call a safe operating space for humanity. So, for example, if we take climate change, which is one of the several global ecological changes that I'm concerned with, as I think everybody knows, we are quite likely to blow past the 2 degrees centigrade that was agreed in Paris as a global target to limit global warming to. But as we continue to exploit fossil fuels, and as we see an energy-hungry or fossil fuel-hungry administration in the US and continuing growth in Russia and China and everywhere else around the world, the likelihood is we will blow past that. And the global warming is a concern because it has all sorts of impacts on societies and communities and on the health of the people who make up those societies and communities. So that's one example. Another one that I think is really quite disturbing and that we don't have a good handle on in terms of health impacts is that we are triggering a sixth great extinction. So there have been 5 previous great extinctions. The last one was 65 million years ago when a meteor struck the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. But the great extinction we're creating, and we're seeing, the scientists tell us we're seeing rates of extinction that are 100 to 10,000 times faster than sort of background rate, is we're destroying habitat, and we're changing the climate, and we are polluting entire ecosystems with persistent organic pollutants and so on. And also, we've become a very large population. So I recently saw some data. Actually, it was a journal article looking at how is the Anthropocene actually showing up in the geologic record. And one of the ways that it's showing up is that right now about 1/3 of all large vertebrate species that would leave their bones in the fossil record, 1/3 of all that mass of vertebrate species on the planet is human. Another 2/3, roughly, is our domesticated species, the great herds of domesticated animals we've created. And only about 5% is wildlife. So in the fossil record, it'll show up very clearly in the future that there was a shift in the population of species.
Do people have enough of a grasp of that when we talk about the social determinants of health? Do we end up being anomic if we don't factor in all of that, those ecological implications into any time we talk about the social determinants of health?
Well, I think part of the problem is that we've come down to a language that talks about the social determinants of health as if they're really the only determinants of health, and they're not. They are one part of a variety of determinants. I mean, in some ways, the most fundamental, I would argue, are ecological determinants of health because air, water, food, fuel, materials that we use to build our civilizations all come from nature. But also there are biological determinants of health, so our genetic inheritance, our physiology, all of that. Those are also determinants of health. And then in some ways, I would argue as a subset of social determinants is the healthcare system, which is a social structure that we create to provide care. But obviously the interest in upstream thinking is that that it is these broader upstream determinants which are both social and ecological. And the unfortunate part of all this is that more broadly, the environmental determinants get ignored in a lot of the social determinants. So, for example, not only do we live within natural ecosystems, but we live within built systems. If you like, cities are urban ecosystems. And we actually in North America and in many other parts of the world now spend 90% of our time indoors, and we're 80% or more urbanized. So the built environment as an environment is very important to our health and well-being. To some extent, that is socially determined to a large extent, but it is not exactly, I would argue, a social determinant of health. It's a built environment is itself a determinant, whether you can open your window, see out through the window, what materials you've built your house from, the quality of your housing, how safe your streets are, how well designed they are, your water and sanitation systems. All of these are huge determinants of health that are not, in my view, strictly speaking, social determinants. So what we really need to do is step back and say there are all of these upstream determinants, the natural environment, the built environment, and the social environment. And we have to understand that they don't stand separate from each other, that they are intimately linked.
Maybe we'll have to start using that term, the upstream determinants of health. Do you think that the wider environment being so omnipresent for us may be part of why it's ignored more often than the others? Is it too difficult to target it in because of how pervasive it is?
Well, I mean, that's possibly one part of it. There's, the old story about a fish in water doesn't recognize that it's in water, it is said. I have no idea what fish really feel, but the point being that we don't necessarily recognize the environment we're sitting in, whether it's a cultural environment or a natural environment or a built environment. It's just where we are, and we accept it. So that's one part of it. The other part is that understanding the scale of what we're doing takes it really out of the local, although obviously there are local implications, but the global ecological changes I'm talking about are happening all over the planet, and so we have to think about the planet as an environment. That's not easy for people to do. And I think a third factor is that there was a very concerted campaign on the part of the corporate and political leadership of around the world, starting in the 1960s and 70s, as these concerns began to be apparent, to dismiss them, to say, oh, we can manage that, we can handle these problems, we can grow, our economic growth will enable us to have the money to fix them, and so on. And things such as a famous report from 1972, The Limits to Growth, at the first UN Conference on the Environment in Stockholm, that report from the Club of Rome was dismissed. But what it actually said was that if we didn't change the way we did business, and I mean business in the sense of the way we run our industrial civilization, we could be facing economic and environmental decline and collapse in the mid-21st century. People have gone back and looked at that and said basically they were right, and we're on track for that. So the combination of willful blindness and denial and the scale of the problem are all some of the factors that go into that.
Do we, as storytellers and health communicators, need to do a better job then of making people realize the imminence of the problem? Are we too much thinking that this is, as a society, are we too much thinking that this is a problem for our grandkids or their kids, and not realizing how imminent and pertinent this is for us?
Well, I think very much we have to make it apparent that this is happening. The analogy I often make is that we don't think it's a good idea if you have a diagnosis of cancer that we not tell you. That we need to be aware of what the situation is, what the problem is. And in some ways, I mean, from the Earth's point of view, you could look upon the human species as a bit of a cancer. But we need to understand what the problem is. We need to face the challenge, just as you do with any serious disease. You have to, first of all, understand and face it, and then you can try and deal with it. There has been a tendency to say, well, you know, the next generation can fix our problems. That's, first of all, unethical. It's not fair to the next generation. And secondly, things are now moving so swiftly. The Earth scientists, people from such as working at the Resilience Institute in Stockholm and in various major international settings, what they talk about is the great acceleration. So if you look at a range of social and economic factors, such as urbanization, such as population growth, such as economic growth, such as the power of our technology, they all begin to take off. Well, not all, but mostly they take off in about the 1950s. And when you plot that in, and then also plot the major changes in Earth systems, those also have gone out of control, really, since the 1950s. And so you get this kind of hockey stick curve that generally is dated to about the 1950s. There's a dispute as to quite when it started. But the other thing to understand in all of this is that both the ecological and the social determinants are intimately linked, that what is driving ecological change is social and economic change. And so we can't hope to deal with ecological change without dealing with and bringing about social and economic change.
Do you think that the pursuit of ecological and climate action that could save our health and our future, is that the same fight as for, like, is equality a big part of that? How do we come to a more equal and more sustainable society at the same time?
Well, it very much is part of it, and it's a very good point, that when you look at, for example, what we call the ecological footprint, which is, I think, a term that's reasonably well known these days. It was actually created by Matisse Wackenagel and Bill Rees at the University of British Columbia back in the 1980s or early 90s. And what it does is it looks at our both consumption of resources and our production of wastes, and tries to figure out how many hectares of or acres of bioproductive land it takes to keep us in the style to which we're accustomed. And when you look at that, what you find is that high-income countries, such as we are in, have an ecological footprint equivalent to 4 or 5 planets worth of impact per person. So what that means is that if the entire world were to live in the way we live, we would need another 3 or 4 planets to sustain our way of life, which obviously we don't have. So there are huge inequalities both within countries. So the ecological footprint, roughly speaking, equates to your income. And so there are inequalities in terms of ecological footprint, both within countries by income and also between countries. And so one of the challenges we face is how do we reduce quite dramatically our ecological footprint? And about half of the ecological footprint, by the way, is carbon. And so this is where these ideas all begin to come together. How do we dramatically reduce, in the case of Canada, by 70 or 80% our ecological footprint, and at the same time maintain a good quality of life with good health, and at the same time reduce those inequalities? Because the old myth was that, well, people who don't have much, the economy will grow and they'll have more. The economy can't keep growing. And once the economy can't grow, then you can't hold out the hope of growth as the way of solving poverty. You have to actually look at redistribution.
Do you think that personal behavior or government policy is the bigger piece of the puzzle, and which one is more difficult to move?
A very good example is people who live in low-income communities often don't have access to healthy, affordable food because they don't have supermarkets there, and they have corner stores that have expensive and unhealthy food. And so, what choice do they have? Or they have fast food outlets.
Food swamps and deserts.
Yeah. So our choices are constrained, and one of the factors we actually need to talk about, we often talk about the social and the economic determinants of health. We actually need to be talking about the corporate and the commercial determinants of health, because our behavior is very much shaped by corporate offerings and by commercial pressures. So there's all of that going on, and then that in turn influences and is influenced by government policy. So to some extent, governments follow, they don't lead. And so if we don't change personal values and personal commitments, then we aren't going to change public policy very easily. But vice versa, public policies can create conditions that make the healthy choice the easy choice. And so our problem is that both through what I call healthy private policy as well as through healthy public policy. A good example of healthy private policy is portion size in restaurants. So no government regulates that. It's a purely private commercial decision as to how big your portion size is. But our portion sizes have grown 20 to 30 to 40% or more over the last few decades. And I'm quite certain that that is a factor contributing to obesity, because we tend to eat what's put in front of us. So that's an unhealthy private policy. Well, how would you make that a healthy private policy, and how would you create healthy public policies too? So all of those, you have to understand it really as kind of an ecosystem of behavior, and there's no one simple quick fix.
Immanuel Kant, I think it was, said a person or a man is rich by what he, not by what he possesses, but by what he can do without. That's sort of attitude. It sounds like we have to try to propagate. Are there signs that you see in the way that racism used to be acceptable and then it became unacceptable? Smoking used to be acceptable, then it became unacceptable. Are there signs that you perceive in the communities that you live in and you work in, that there are more and more social unacceptabilities of ecological negative externality?
I think that is slowly happening, and certainly, I mean, I live in Victoria in British Columbia, which is pretty green and friendly place. We have the country's only green MP here, and so there's a lot of values here that are consistent with that. I mean, but you'll also find a lot of values that are not. So it's a bit of a mosaic. But certainly, there's a much greater focus on bicycling and walking, and how do we create healthy transportation options. But those healthy transportation options are also low carbon. So it's an area that gets into what we talk about as the health co-benefits of sustainable development policy. So having an urban development policy that creates more dense, mixed-use communities means that people don't need a car to get around. They can walk or bike, or if you have good transit, which is another important public policy, then you can take the bus or the train. And you'll see those kind of policies in action in Europe, for example, but they haven't really yet fully made it over here. There are health co-benefits of a low-meat diet, which is good because a low-meat diet, one of the biggest pressures on the ecosystem, in fact, is the amount of environmental damage that a high-meat agricultural system creates. So changing our diets is both good for our health and good for the planet. So how do you switch from a high-meat to a low-meat diet? And I think that you mentioned smoking. I think one of the things that certainly we talk about in the report we did for the Canadian Public Health Association on the ecological determinants of health is that we have been here before. We have a track record that we can build upon. The most obvious recent example is smoking, but also I would say drinking and driving, which used to be seen as kind of an okay thing you joked about, and now I don't think many people joke about it. So we've created significant changes in social norms, and if you go even further back, in a sense, you could say what we're dealing with now at a global level is the sort of challenge that was faced by public health and social reformers in the mid-19th century in the industrializing cities of Europe and North America in particular, where you had massive and horrible, massive damage and horrible environmental and living conditions. And really within a comparatively short space of time, 50 to 75 years, that was turned around, not entirely, not fully, not perfectly, but dramatically different in 50 years from where it was in the mid-1850s. So we know that we can do these kind of massive changes that improve the environment and improve health. We now have to do it at a global scale.
Do you think that Canada is already, or can more so, serve as a leader to lead the way in that regard? I believe it's accurate that now compared to 5 or 10 years ago, globally, we're actually eating more meat in addition to other things like burning more fossil fuels, because as parts of the developing world grow their individual purchasing power parity and people's living standards raised, they have a higher demand for meat. Do you see any policy actions or cultural changes coming out of Canada to serve as a role of leadership for other culture or other communities?
Well, I think Canada has a mixed record on this. So back in the 1980s, we were kind of Mr. Clean in terms of our environmental reputation, and that got quite tattered. We failed to meet our Kyoto targets, and that wasn't just due to the Conservative Harper government. It was that was set up for failure by the Chrétien Liberal government before them. And we were getting in the last few years at the climate conferences, I forget what the name of the award was, but it was the sort of the Bad Boy Award, or the Bad Country Award for our failure to act on climate change. I don't think we're the model. I think the models are found in Europe much more. But compared to the US, we're a bit more of a model. But I certainly think we can play a leadership role. But that is going to mean some tough decisions. So, for example, recent decisions that support the expansion of the oil sands that build pipelines, they are bad decisions, bad federal and provincial decisions that are not going to move us towards where we have to go fairly quickly, which is to be off fossil fuels. There's already enough fossil fuel, oil, coal, and gas, either in production or under development, that if we burned all that's simply already in production or under development, we will blow past 2 degrees centigrade of warming. And yet they continue to want to grow that sector. Totally the wrong decision, an unhealthy public policy that has to be reversed.
Do you? I believe it was just today the news came out that Shell just pulled out or reneged or canceled out their tar sands ownership, and I believe they just dedicated $1 billion a year every year spending on renewable energy. Is that just PR, or do you think that that's a sign of a new trend in where we're heading?
I think that's the trend. I mean, I think there's going to be the dinosaurs in the oil industry who are going to keep wanting to do what they've been doing. But BP and Shell in particular have seen their future as energy companies rather than oil companies. And that's how we need to be looking at it. So you become an energy service company. And whether you make money by increasing efficiency and selling insulation and conserving energy, because the largest single source of energy is actually conservation, or whether you make money by committing to renewals, it doesn't really matter from their point of view. They're making money. And I'm not opposed to people making money. I'm just opposed to people making money in ways that worsen health and worsen the environment.
What are your you're talking about what you're in favor for, what you're driven by, as a physician, as a healer? What were the original sources for you that powered you towards environmental action and advocacy for ecological determinants of health? Is that something you've always had on your radar and in your interest, or was there like a light bulb moment for you where you thought, this is where I can be of greatest use as a healer?
Oh, interesting question. I mean, I think you'd have to go, I'm 68, so you'd have to go back more than 50 years. I was, in high school, I was actually undecided as to whether I was going to be what we then called a naturalist or possibly a veterinarian. And I ended up going into medicine. I'm not quite sure why, frankly, but I did. And so I was in medicine with an awareness of the natural environment. And also, when I was about 50 years ago now, when I was 18 years old, I spent a year as a volunteer teacher in Sarawak in North Borneo, living and working in a community that was somewhat remote. There was no road into it. You got in by boat. But it was, I don't know, 10, 20,000 people. And didn't have, this is in 1967, 66, 67, didn't have a lot of the quote-unquote modern benefits, but basically lived pretty happy, healthy lives. So I think I went into medical school, or I know I did, with an awareness that it wasn't medicine that made them happy and healthy. So I think all of that came together, and then I got involved when I was actually still in medical school in reading a journal called The Ecologist. And out of that emerged what became the first ecological political party in England in the 1970s. And I became an area organizer for that party. So I started getting involved in ecological politics. So it's a combination of all of those things brought me to, first of all, I worked as a family physician in rural New Brunswick and then in Community Health Centre in Toronto. But I fairly quickly moved out of that into public health because I really wanted to go upstream. And that's where I've been heading for the last 40 years.
It's certainly been an incredibly contributive 40 years to our national and global understandings of the real sources of health. Um, Absolutely unimaginable where we'd be without it. Who are your biggest sources of inspiration that have sort of either are currently working today or leading up to this point have inspired you across the years?
Well, I guess some of the great ecologists, René Dubos, or sort of health ecologists, if you like, people like René Dubos, who was actually a microbiologist, who brought together these ideas around health and human ecology. Harding Leriche, when I was doing my master's at U of T, was a professor there who wrote about the ecology of medical care, or the relationship between ecology and medical care, or ecological thinking. John Last, who also wrote about human ecology and public health, and others in that field. So I would say that the people who could think big picture, whether particularly those three happen to be physicians, but others who these days the sort of earth scientists who are pioneering the Anthropocene. But then at the same time, it's the local level. So I'm a very big believer in think globally but act locally, which actually was a phrase René Dubos, I think, came up with. And think globally and act locally is what I'm trying to do right now. So here in Victoria, I've started a series of what we're calling conversations for a one planet region, where we're just bringing people together to talk about what would this region look like if it only had an ecological footprint equivalent to one planet, so 70 or 80% less than right now, but had a good quality of life and a long life and a healthy life. And so we're starting to have those conversations. And certainly my whole experience, I was very involved in helping to launch the whole idea of healthy cities and healthy communities. And I have always believed, and I think the evidence is fairly clear, that many of the most important advances for public health happen first at the local level. They don't happen nationally or provincially. Nationally or provincially, they follow the local lead. So whether we're talking about action on tobacco or action on clean water or action on healthy transportation or food security or any of those issues, I think where you see action and where you see hope and where you see progress is at the local level. And that's why I'm such a big devotee of healthy cities and communities, of how do you help cities and communities they actually understand this better already than national or provincial governments. A very good example is national and provincial governments tend to measure our progress in terms of GDP, which it's another whole conversation, but GDP as a measure of progress, or even as a measure of the economy, totally sucks. And local governments don't. I don't know any local government that uses the GDP to navigate it. They generally are interested in measuring quality of life across a range of different domains. So I think that local governments have a much more sophisticated understanding of social well-being and social progress, and actually national and provincial governments need to learn from them.
Can we go even more, can we go even closer and go to an even more micro level and look to Indigenous and Northern communities? Are they even are they in some ways the most equipped to handle that sort of 70% less world?
Well, I think so. Both here within Canada, that will be the case, and certainly First Nations and Indigenous people have a much closer relationship to nature. I mean, one of the other areas I'm interested in actually is how do we foster a link between people and nature, because that link has been eroded. But they have that understanding much more so than we do. But the other one, you talked earlier about diets changing in Asia, in China, for example. The kind of irony there is that we actually all need to be moving towards a Chinese diet or an Indian diet rather than people in India and China moving towards a Western diet.
Mm.
And so I think we can look at that. For example, one of the indicators I'm interested in is the Happy Planet Index, which was created by the New Economics Foundation in London. The Happy Planet Index, basically, it's been used nationally, but we're hoping to use it regionally here and elsewhere. I'm working with some colleagues in Australia and the UK on this. What it does is it measures length of life and quality of life and level of inequality as a single index divided by your ecological footprint. And so a high Happy Planet Index score is an indicator of a high level of human development that is equitably distributed and a low ecological footprint. The number one country in the world is Costa Rica.
Really?
The other top 4 or 5, or the top 5 include Vietnam, Cuba, I think, if I remember correctly. I don't remember all 5 of them off the top of my head. Canada on that index is 85th. The USA is 105th.
Wow.
So we need to be thinking also, as I mentioned earlier, GDP sucks. We need to think of better ways of measuring progress. And so what would this region look like if it had a high Happy Planet Index?
Mm-hmm. That's a fascinating a metric to use, both the Happy Planet Index and the being able to divide that by ecological footprint sounds like a fairly good metric for determining just success in general, and in terms of success going on into the future and sustainable human development.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's why I'm interested in working with it both. With the New Economics Foundation, with my colleagues in Australia and the UK, and right here in Victoria. It's almost never been done yet that people have measured the Happy Planet Index at a regional level. It wasn't designed for that, but I actually think we can probably do that in the next year or two, and then I'd like to see it spread across the country.
I did my my master's degree in Costa Rica and my undergraduate thesis in Cuba, and there's certainly a stark difference in where their priorities are in terms for future sustainability.
Well, there you go. Well, we'll have to hire you to run this thing.
Hey, give me a call. What do you see the country or the world or your local communities moving more upstream in general? Are you optimistic about trends and how we're addressing these problems?
Well, I'd have to say that if I look globally, I'm probably pessimistic, because the forces that are pushing us in the wrong direction are very powerful, and it's, we can't, this is part of the equity issue, we can't turn round to India or China or wherever and say, sorry folks, you can't have what we've got. We're going to keep what we've got, but the world can't support you, so you're going to have to not have what we have. Mm-hmm. That's not going to fly. It's not ethical. It's not politically sellable. So that's why I'm also interested in creating change here in high-income countries, because we have to both learn from places like Cuba and Costa Rica and Vietnam and so on how to have a good life with a low footprint, and at the same time we have to model it first. We have to show that we can change, or else we are in no position to ask anybody else to change. So that to me seems like a very tough sell, and so at a global level I tend to be a bit pessimistic. At a local level, I'm not quite sure I'm prepared to say I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful. There has always been a lot of work going on locally, and you just have to, this series of conversations I'm doing, the people who are there on the ground doing work locally, whether it's community gardens or bicycle paths or low-impact housing or being off the grid or whatever it is, all of those things are happening all over our community. They're happening all over every community across the country. And so that's where I see enormous hope.
Hmm. Absolutely, there's a great deal locally that we see changing at Upstream as well. People thinking more and more towards what really is at the root of what they care about. Not necessarily the services that they can get at the hospital, but the things that they can access in their community to make themselves and their other members more healthy and improve their own well being. Do you get any optimism from China now with their moves towards more sustainable development, investing in the green energy of other countries, solar panel productions, and all of that? Are they a new leader in that global fight?
I think so, and I think that's also true for. They've certainly had a strong interest, as you know. There's massive urban development going on in China, and there's been quite a lot of interest there in the notion of sustainable cities or green cities, and also of healthy cities. And I think that's the other thing that why I'm very interested in things like the Happy Planet Index and the One Planet thinking that's related to that, which is that we have to integrate the environmental and the social and the health, and to understand that they are really just different facets of the same thing, and that you can't have healthy people if you don't have healthy communities, and you can't have a healthy community if you don't have a healthy planet. And so it's not as if they're three separate boxes. They're actually an interacting system.
How did you, or can you tell us how you felt, or how you have felt in the months from November to now, with the changes we've seen in the United States? A lot of people were really hopeful, and a lot of people had those hopes dashed. How did you feel on the day that their election results came back?
You mean other than being sickened?
Other than including, yeah.
Well, I mean, sickened on a variety of levels. One is we we've just seen the U.S. Elect a boorish and ugly quasi-fascist. Um, to be kind, no, not at all. There's no reason to be kind. The man is and then the people around him are a threat to democracy. I mean, the parallels with the rise of Hitler are actually very scary. And I don't think Trump is quite a Hitler, but I think that some of the people around him might be. I think he's too much of a buffoon to be a Hitler, but so there's that aspect. And then, of course, he wants to throw out the EPA's rules, and I mean, just yesterday, the new executive, the chief of the Environmental Protection Agency was saying he wasn't convinced that CO2 had anything to do with global warming. I mean, it's unbelievable stuff. And they're going to want to maximize coal mining and the fossil fuel industry in general. And look who they just appointed as the Secretary of State, the head of an oil company. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's very troubling. I guess the only good news I could see in it, if I try and look for some good news, is that this may be the final spasm, the final gasp of the old order. And it's going to be ugly. It's going to be nasty. But it may be sufficiently ugly and nasty that people wake up and say, whoa, this is really not the way to go. And so we might get if you like, a counter-revolution. And that's what I'm hoping for.
Mm-hmm. I think we're seeing that somewhat, at least at the grassroots level. Canadians, if you were watching the maelstrom of political upheaval in the Conservative Party right now, and also just all of the parties, really, the talking points are either directly referential to or dog whistling at, we don't want to look like Trump, and that those political that political persuasion, because we know how bad we're going to look in the eyes of the people here.
And I do think that we have to transition away from what is essentially a 19th century way of thinking, the old industrial paradigm, the old industrial model, and Trump and that whole world is an attempt to go back to the 19th century. We actually have to go forward to the 21st and the 22nd century. And so Going back is not going to help. In fact, it'll make things worse. But I think that also applies in a lot of other areas, not just industrial policy. As I say, the whole issue of GDP. I mean, that's it's an outmoded way of thinking. And really, in broad terms, we have to switch from one of the things I talk about when I work with cities is what business are we in? And national and provincial governments think that we're in the business of growing the economy. Cities are much closer to understanding that the business of government is human development, sustainable human development. And so you measure progress not by the level of your economy, but by the level of your human capital. Human capital is kind of an ugly term, but the level of human development, the extent to which people are reaching their full human potential.
It's amazing when you contrast the GDP changes with the like the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, how you can clearly see the political priorities because the GDP has continued to rise and popularity and approval has come from that. But meanwhile, the actual Wellbeing Index has been pretty stagnant. It would be great if we could start to see that trend reverse in the coming years.
Well, if there's another index out there called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is quite similar to the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, but a bit older, actually been around longer. And the GPI in the US has essentially been flat since the 1970s, whereas GDP has gone up. And the reason for that is very simple, that the analogy I often use is this: if you had 10 cents to invest and you wanted to maximize your impact on GDP, what would you invest your 10 cents in?
In the short term, I'm not sure, but in the long term, yeah, only 10 cents.
It's only 10 cents. Well, the answer is you buy a book of matches and you torch the biggest building you can find.
Oh yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you'd hire the firefighters, the paramedics, the people who make coffins, I guess.
Yep. For the insurance industry, the people who come in and demolish it, the people who design and build a new one. Meanwhile, you have to rent space elsewhere to house all the people and businesses. And it's similar with, when the Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound, it added hundreds of millions of dollars to the Alaskan economy because of the cleanup costs. So what GDP does is it fails to distinguish between positive and negative expenditures. Another really good example out of our own field is tobacco. So the tobacco industry's activities add to GDP. And the activities of the healthcare system to treat people with diseases caused by tobacco add to the GDP. So actually, another good way to increase GDP is to increase the number of people who smoke. I mean, it's crazy stuff. It doesn't measure anything that makes any sense.
And yet, for so many people, that's still the maybe not the end all be all, but certainly the king metric.
Yes.
In terms of what matters. Yeah. That's the justification we see a lot. Yeah, no, we definitely need to flip that on its head, to be sure.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you so much, Trevor, for speaking with me today. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure talking to you.
Well, it was fun.